The year is 1975. Tens of millions of Americans are sitting in front of their television sets, completely unaware that what they are about to witness will change the way they watch TV forever. A soldier walks into an operating room, hat in hand, face pale. The surgeons are elbow deep in a patient, focused, tired, doing what they always do. And then, quietly, almost too quietly, radar speaks. He says that Henry Blake's plane was shot down over the Sea of Japan, that there were no survivors, no music, no dramatic sting, no laugh track, just silence, and then the sound of surgical equipment beeping into the void. The audience didn't know it was coming. Most of the cast didn't know it was coming. And in that single moment, a comedy about war stopped being a comedy. It became something far more devastating, something true. But here's what nobody was talking about in the days after that episode aired. While audiences were grieving a fictional colonel, a very real war was happening behind the scenes of MASH. A war between ambition and loyalty, between ego and art, between the person you are on camera and the person slowly breaking down off it. Several of the most beloved actors on that show made the decision to walk away. And the reasons? They are far more complicated, far more heartbreaking, and far more human than you have ever been told. Because this isn't just a story about a television show. This is a story about what happens when the cameras stop rolling, about the price of fame, about what it costs to pour yourself into something extraordinary, and then realize you are disappearing inside of it. And it starts with a man who wanted to be a star so badly, he threw away the one thing that would have made him one. McLean Stevenson was never supposed to be the second banana. He was funny, magnetic, warm in a way that very few actors can manufacture. As Colonel Henry Blake, the bumbling, big-hearted commanding officer of the 4077th, he was the kind of character audiences instinctively trusted, the kind of man you wanted to survive the war, and audiences loved him for it. A Golden Globe, critical praise, fan mail by the truckload. But something was happening inside McLean that nobody could see from the outside. The show was changing, slowly at first, then all at once. Alan Alda, who played Hawkeye Pierce, was becoming something more than just a co-lead. He was becoming the soul of the series. He was writing, he was directing, he was shaping the moral DNA of the show from the inside out. And McLean was still playing the lovable fool. He once told People magazine, openly and without apology, that he wanted to be number one, that he wanted to be the guy carrying the show. And people read that and thought it was ego. But it wasn't ego. It was fear. The fear of an actor who could feel himself being swallowed whole by a role that no longer had room to grow. He had watched Hollywood long enough to know what happened to the second banana. You became the joke. You became the bit. You became the man who stood in the background while someone else carried the scene. So at the end of season 3, McLean made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He told the producers he was leaving. Now here is where the story gets dangerous, because the writers of MASH were not the kind of people who let an opportunity pass them by. When most shows would have quietly written a character off, given him a transfer or a promotion or a tearful farewell that resolved cleanly, MASH did something that had never been done before on American television. They killed him, not on screen, not with fanfare. They waited until the very last moment of the very last episode of the season, until audiences had spent 25 minutes celebrating Henry Blake's discharge, believing he was going home, believing he had survived. And then radar walked in, and the world cracked open. Most of the cast found out the same time the audience did, because the producers were terrified of a leak. Gary Burghoff, who played Radar, was the only one told in advance so he could prepare emotionally. The rest of the cast, the doctors frozen mid-surgery, the nurses standing in the doorway, their reactions were not acting. That was genuine shock on their faces. That was real grief. CBS received thousands of letters. Some were grateful. Some were furious. One writer accused the producers of cruelty. Larry Gelbart, who co-created the series, simply said, "We wanted to say that not everybody gets to go home." And McLean Stevenson? He signed with NBC. He launched his own show. Then another. Neither survived more than one season. By 1983, he was sitting in a Los Angeles Times interview quietly admitting, "I took myself out of the game." He had walked away from lightning in a bottle, chasing a storm that never came, and he spent the rest of his life knowing it. When he passed away in 1996, Alan Alda called him a wonderful actor and a good man. But the most haunting tribute came not from any colleague. It came from the silence of a career that never found its second act. But McLean's exit, as dramatic as it was in consequence, at least came with a goodbye. What happened next was something far stranger, something that caught even the producers completely off guard. Wayne Rogers didn't make a speech. He didn't negotiate. He didn't give interviews about his frustrations or his ambitions. One season he was there, the sharp-tongued, effortlessly charming Trapper John, the other half of the greatest comedic partnership in television history. And then he was simply gone. No farewell scene. No hospital send-off. No moment where Hawkeye and Trapper looked at each other one last time and said what needed to be said. Just an off-screen line in the Season 4 premiere explaining that Trapper had been discharged while Hawkeye was away on leave. As if he had never mattered. As if 11 years of friendship could be summarized in a single throwaway sentence. Audiences were blindsided and furious. But the real story was stranger than anyone knew. Because when the producers threatened to sue Wayne for breach of contract, they discovered something that made the entire legal threat collapse instantly. Wayne had never actually signed his contract. He had been working the entire time on a handshake deal, which meant he hadn't breached anything. He had simply walked away from a promise that was never written down. He later explained his reasons without anger and without apology. Trapper John had gone from being a leading man to the guy who nodded at everything Alan said. He hadn't left because of jealousy. He had left because he respected storytelling enough to know when a character had been written into a corner with no way out. What came next surprised everyone, including the critics who had dismissed his departure as a tantrum. Mike Farrell arrived as B.J. Honeycutt, and the show didn't collapse. It deepened. It slowed down. It grew a conscience it hadn't fully had before. The buddy comedy gave way to something more melancholy, more honest about the weight of war on a human soul. MASH became legendary in the very seasons that Wayne Rogers was no longer in them. And Wayne himself, he walked away from Hollywood almost entirely, built a career on Wall Street, became a respected financial commentator, made millions outside the industry that had made him famous. Alan Alda once said Wayne was one of the smartest people he had ever worked with. When Wayne passed away in 2015, Alda tweeted that they had made a pact to give each other a hard time for the rest of their lives, and that he was sorry they wouldn't have the chance. There is something quietly beautiful about that. Two men who shared something irreplaceable, separated by pride and circumstance, never losing the thread of what they meant to each other. But if McLean's story is about ambition and Wayne's is about principle, then what comes next is something altogether different, something sadder, something that cuts right to the bone. Because Gary Burghoff didn't leave MASH because he wanted more. He left because MASH had taken almost everything he had. To understand Gary, you have to understand Radar, not the character on the surface, the round glasses and the teddy bear and the ability to hear helicopters before anyone else. You have to understand what Radar represented. In a show full of brilliant, broken, outraged adults, Radar was the child, the one who hadn't yet learned to be cynical, the one whose innocence the war hadn't fully consumed. Gary had played the same character in the original 1970 film, but on television, he transformed Radar into something the film never attempted. He made him tender. He made him heartbreakingly real. And in doing so, he poured something of himself into that character that he could never fully take back. By season 7, the cracks were visible to those paying attention. Gary was battling anxiety and depression at a time when nobody in Hollywood talked about such things. The production schedule was relentless. The emotional demands of the role were enormous. And every day he spent on that set was another day he wasn't home with his daughter, watching her grow up. He later said that missing those years felt like a mistake he never stopped regretting. His co-star Mike Farrell would recall years later that Gary always felt he wasn't receiving the appreciation he deserved. But Farrell also believed Gary had underestimated how deeply he was loved by everyone around him. That gap between how much the world valued him and how little he could feel it is one of the most quietly devastating details in the entire history of the show. When Gary finally left in season 8, the writers gave Radar something they hadn't given Trapper. They gave him a proper farewell. 2 full episodes. A storyline where Radar realizes the 4077th can function without him, where he understands it is time to go home. The final image is almost wordless. Radar walking away across the Korean landscape, silhouetted against an open sky. His teddy bear left behind on Hawkeye's bunk, not taken with him. Left behind, as if childhood itself had been surrendered. Audiences wept, and they didn't fully understand why, except that it felt like losing something they hadn't known they were holding on to. After MASH, Gary stepped away from Hollywood almost entirely. He took up painting. He devoted himself to wildlife conservation. He invented things, held patents, built a quiet life as far from the spotlight as he could get. He once said he left for 2 reasons: his family and burnout. He wanted to pick up the pieces of his life. And somehow, in all of that, in the distance and the silence and the slow healing, Gary Burghoff might have been the wisest one of all. But the story of MASH is not only a story of people breaking under pressure. Sometimes, it is a story of a person looking at what they have built and deciding, with full clarity, that they have taken it as far as it can go. Larry Linville knew exactly what Frank Burns was. He had built the character from the ground up. The pettiness, the paranoia, the pathetic desperation of a man who enforced rules because he was terrified of the chaos inside himself. Frank Burns was one of television's greatest comic villains precisely because Larry Linville understood him from the inside out. But by season 5, something had shifted. The show around Frank had grown. The other characters had evolved, complicated themselves, surprised the audience. And Frank remained exactly the same, cartoonishly rigid, reliably awful, predictably himself. And Larry, an actor with enormous range that the show had never fully utilized, could feel it. He wasn't being challenged anymore. He was being recycled. So he made a decision that required a kind of professional courage most actors never find. He walked away. Not because he was pushed, not because of conflict or contract disputes, but because he understood that Frank Burns had said everything Frank Burns had to say. His exit forced the writers to do something radical. With no cartoon villain to kick around, MASH had to find its comedy somewhere deeper, somewhere more uncomfortable. It had to find the darkness inside the people the audience already loved. That shift turned a very good show into something genuinely immortal. And then there was Winchester. Charles Emerson Winchester III, played by Ogden Stiers, arriving in season 6 like a cold front moving through a warm room. Where Frank had been petty and obvious, Winchester was formidable, cultured, brilliant, infuriating in a way that demanded respect even as it provoked fury. Ogden Stiers played him with surgical precision, revealing vulnerability in the smallest moments, a tightening of the jaw, a pause before a response, a flash of something human behind all that armored pride. Winchester stayed until the final episode. His last scene, teaching Chinese prisoners of war to play Mozart, is one of the most quietly devastating images in the history of American television. He didn't leave early. He didn't leave in protest. He left when the story was complete, and when offered a place in the spin-off, he declined. Winchester had said what he needed to say. Ogden Stiers lived his personal life with the same kind of private dignity he brought to that character. For decades, he kept his sexuality to himself, not out of shame, but out of fear of what the industry would do with the knowledge. He came out publicly in 2009 and spoke about it plainly, saying he was gay and very proud to be so. He passed away in 2018. His legacy is not just in the performances he left behind, but in the quiet courage it took to finally live without the armor. And through all of these departures, all of this change and loss and reinvention, one person never left. Loretta Swit was there at the beginning, and she was there at the end, in all 11 seasons, one of only 4 actors to appear in both the pilot and the finale. She had taken a character written to be the punchline, a woman defined entirely by a nickname that reduced her to her body, and she had refused to let that be the whole story. Season by season, she built Margaret Houlihan into something the writers hadn't originally planned for. A woman of genuine substance, a decorated officer, a skilled nurse, a human being complicated enough to hold contradictions without collapsing under them. In a show about men surviving war, Loretta Swit quietly ensured that the one woman in the opening credits was impossible to ignore. And that, perhaps, is what MASH really was. Not just a show about the Korean War, or about the Vietnam War it was actually speaking to, or even about war at all. It was about what people do when they are pushed to their absolute limit, about who they become when everything comfortable has been stripped away, about the price of the work and the cost of the art and the impossible human need to be seen, to matter, to leave something behind that outlasts you. McLean Stevenson left chasing a dream that dissolved. Wayne Rogers left on principle and rebuilt himself from scratch. Gary Burghoff left to save what remained of himself. Larry Linville left with the rare grace of a man who knows when a story is over. Ogden Stiers stayed until the final frame, and then spent the rest of his life learning to be fully himself. None of them got it perfectly right. None of them could have, because the show they were part of was larger than any one of them, larger than any decision any of them made, larger, somehow, than even its own 11 seasons and its record-breaking finale watched by over 100 million people. MASH did not end when the last helicopter flew off screen. It lives in the silence after Radar's announcement, in the teddy bear on an empty bunk, in the word that was spelled out in rocks on the hillside, visible only from above, visible only if you were looking from far enough away to see the whole picture. Goodbye.